I just want to say thank you to Julie Murphy. I know is not here, and Rebecca Guest isn't here, but both of them have been so patient with me and so enthusiastic to have me come down, and I'm just really grateful for that. I've been reporting a different book for the last 4 years, and they just were wonderful. And since I've arrived, I can just tell that you all have like a really warm community around this museum, and everybody's just been so lovely. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with a short excerpt from the book, and I'll be reading little snippets throughout my presentation tonight. This is from a chapter called The Last Roadless Place. It took 5 years of planning and 56 days of sailing for British privateer Martin Frobisher to discover Baffin Island in the Arctic in 1576. Propelled by jet fuel in a Boeing 737, it took me 12 hours to skip over 23 degrees in latitude and arrive in the very same place 440 years later. I had come to the Arctic because the landscape has hardly changed in the past 400 years, or in the 1,000 years before that. It is one of the last roadless places on Earth. Just a few hundred yards outside of town, there are no houses, lights, cars, railroads, signage, or cell towers. Just ice, snow, rocks, and combinations of these elements in jutting and cascading variations. Most of the common navigation skills that will get you by anywhere else are nearly useless in this environment. GPS only lasts as long as a battery, and it can guilelessly lead you along treacherous routes, across faulty sea ice, or into bad weather. The magnetic field tries to pull compass needles downward. Even natural cues are fickle. The stars disappear in summer. In winter, the sun appears to rise in the south and sets in the north. Polaris is a trustless companion for a traveler. Above the Arctic Circle, you are north. Landmarks change appearance from season to season as snow gathers or ice melts. So I'm a science journalist mainly, and one of the reasons why I love my occupation is that most of my reporting starts with an experience or a question that kind of leads me and provides me with a thread to pursue in my reporting. And so this book started with an experience that I had in New Mexico. I was traveling to a local hot spring that someone had told me about with my partner, and we put the name of the hot spring into our smartphone and followed the route that it gave us, which was through sort of the sagebrush desert. And we traveled for about 30 minutes over these dirt roads, and then finally came to the edge of the Rio Grande and a cliff overlooking the river. And it was clear to us that somewhere below us there was this hot spring, but we had no way to access it. And our GPS didn't seem to realize that, if we actually followed its directions, we would surely die. And at the time, this power to have GPS in our smartphones was still somewhat new. The fact that we all could have this at our fingertips, and there was a lot of news stories about people who were following their GPS and getting into real trouble, even deadly situations where they would meet with bad weather on rural roads that were, on old maps but not usable. One of my favorite stories was of a American tourist in Iceland who landed in Reykjavik, got into his rental car and put in the name of the hotel he was going to, and then proceeded to drive for something like 8 hours to the north of the country. And when he finally got to the town, was told that he was, in completely the wrong place. And he had added an extra R to his destination, which seems like maybe a very easy thing to do in Icelandic. But he knew his hotel was near the city, and yet he had sort of trusted his GPS more than his own sort of common sense. And this seemed to be like a very common phenomenon. And it got me thinking a lot about the power of this technology, but also why were we so quickly adapting it? And what was it that we were doing before we had that? What was it that we were doing before we even had maps, which are fairly, in the scale of human evolution, a fairly recent invention? And so the answers really brought me to anthropology and oral history, indigenous knowledge, but also neuroscience, and that's where I'll begin tonight. I want to do a little memory exercise with you guys and just ask you to kind of focus your thoughts on how you got to where you are sitting tonight. I assume many of you drove. That seems to be the dominant mode of transportation here, but also just thinking about where you parked your car and then how you came into the building and the path that you took. And once you have sort of conjured that recent memory, I'd like you to recall something from your deeper past, such as like one of your childhood birthdays, and where it was, and who was there, and if you can recall what they looked like, and maybe a present that you got or a type of cake that you ate. And both of these memories, this recent recall of like your route that you got here today, and also this recall of the past of an event from your own personal history, takes place in the hippocampus of our brains. And this is a really cool photograph of a hippocampus in a mouse brain. And here's just a neat view of where the hippocampus is located in our brain. And so this spot is responsible for both spatial memory as well as what's called episodic memory, which is our recall of events in the past. And I like to think of it as kind of the locus of our autobiography, our personal story through time. This is where a lot of those memories are kept. It's also the place in the brain responsible for imagining the future, interestingly. So if you think about where you're going to be tomorrow, or even say at Christmas, and what that might look like and what you might be doing and where you might be, that imagining of the future is also activating this part of the brain. This is a really interesting person by the name of Henry Mollison. He was known as HM in the scientific literature for many decades. His is one of the most famous cases of amnesia in scientific literature. He was an epileptic, and in the 1950s, at the age of 27, he had part of his temporal lobes removed. And he lost his ability to acquire and recollect memories. He described his conscious existence as like waking from a dream constantly. And he was forever in a new place. So it took him years to carefully even memorize the floor plan of his own house. He had to wake up every day and sort of navigate it as like a new place. And the reason is because he no longer had the hippocampus of his brain. He spent a lot of time at MIT. And it was his case and the studies that he participated in that led scientists to identify the hippocampus as the place where this episodic memory, our recall of past events, takes place. This is just a closer view of those neural cells in the hippocampus. One of the people that I write about in the book is a man by the name of John O'Keefe. And in the 1970s, he was doing experiments where he inserted electrodes into the thalamus of rats. And ironically, one day he got the wrong coordinates, and he put the electrode into the wrong part of the rat brain, and ended up inserting it into the hippocampus by accident. And so he began recording the firing of this cell in the rat's brain, and its pattern of firing struck him as very, very unusual. And it seemed to be really strongly correlated to where the rat was in space. And so O'Keefe ended up calling these cells that he had mistakenly discovered place cells. And he believed that they proved this obscure theory that had been put forth over half a century before, this theory of like a cognitive map, that there's this map in the hippocampus, O'Keefe theorized, whose purpose was to construct models of the physical universe. This is a really neat picture of a rat moving through a maze with electrodes in the hippocampus, and these different colors represent the firing of different place cells in that part of the rat's brain. This comes from a laboratory at MIT called the Wilson Lab, and I'll just read a short excerpt about the leader of that lab. Matt Wilson is a neuroscientist at MIT. He calls the classic experiments of running rats through mazes and listening to their brain cells eavesdropping, and he has been doing it for years to try and understand what this system of cells has to do with memory. Testing the relationship takes ingenuity. Quote, "If you damage the hippocampus in humans or rodents, you will lose the capacity to form memories of life experience. Now, it's hard to ask those life experience questions to a rat, but what you can do is test them on another kind of memory. Just ask a rat to go back to a place it's already been. Rats have very good spatial memory." The connection between spatial navigation and memory of life experiences, according to Wilson, is time. Quote, "Both navigation and memory depend on a critical function linking things in time," he said, "is how you put the pieces together, how you create an internal narrative of your experience. It's not a record or videotape of experience. It involves evaluating, selecting, and sorting things. Rats create an experience of moving around in space. We create the stories of our lives." So we see a lot of descriptions in the literature of the 19th and 20th centuries of individuals who are able to find their way through featureless landscapes without the use of any sort of material maps. And to colonizers and settlers and explorers who are going into these places and meeting these individuals, this ability to find their way with sometimes incredible accuracy through what was considered a featureless landscape was magical and almost mysterious. People could not understand how precise locations could be identified, remembered, and communicated without the use of maps. Even Darwin was sort of fascinated by this question and trying to figure out, as he would read reports of explorers who were going to places like Russia and was trying to understand how this ability fit into his own scientific sort of paradigm. I'm going to go back, actually. So since the mid-1800s, there was this explanation that these so-called non-industrialists had a kind of unconscious instinct that they used to find their way. And this was one of Darwin's speculations as well. You would see these descriptions from colonists in India, New Zealand, and people believed that they were sort of guided by an unerring instinct. That some part of their brain was specialized for the function of direction. And it became known as this idea of the sixth sense by the early 1900s. And this idea has really been put to bed for a long time now, but it persisted for a really long time. And so, why? Why did people sort of give this idea of a specialized sixth sense to so-called non-industrialized such weight for so long? And one explanation is that by the 19th century, Europeans themselves had so many aids in navigation. They had maps, compasses, watches, roads, that they actually had forgotten there were other ways of navigating outside of these forms of, navigational aids and technologies. And so there was this sense of historical amnesia when they encountered people in other places who had different ways of wayfinding. But the truth was that throughout human history, navigation without instruments was the norm, not, compasses and watches and maps. This is a picture that I took in the Arctic. You can see a snowmobile track here that we were following. There is like a mountain in the distance, but this flatness and the sort of lack of what I would consider like identifying features is like so common. This is actually like a frozen inlet in a bay. And so this is quite like typical landscape for that region where I was in Nunavut. And one of the anthropologists that I talked to about this place was a man by the name of Claudia Aporta. And he wrote about how the Inuit use routes that are passed down between generations. So these routes become visible in certain periods, like tracks in the snow this way, like in this picture. And then they disappear in other seasons. And he told me that a good traveler in this place always knows where he or she is. And he called them memoryscapes. They're mental images of places in the environment that are remembered and they're shared among people. And this was one of the people that I interviewed when I was there. His name is Solomon Awa. He is the 8th child of parents who spent their whole lives on the land. In order to keep him at home, they had to give the Canadian government 2 of their other children to be sent to, a government school. But the result was that out of 11 children, Awa was the only one who also grew up on the land, learning how to navigate in this traditional way. And so he told me about some of the strategies that he learned as a hunter and navigator in this part of the Arctic. And so this is an example of something called uccolorate. These are like tongue-shaped formations that are found on sea ice, and they're created by the dominant winds. So once you know the direction of the dominant wind, you can look at this like a compass on the ground. And even if a storm is blowing and you're losing, your visual reference points and orientation, all you have to do is look down on the ground, maybe even scrape away the top of the snow that's fallen recently and look to see where these formations are pointing. Awa said, quote, "When you leave the community, you watch the tongues and which way you are cutting across them. So when you want to come back home, you do it the opposite way. If you are cutting straight up when you are leaving, then you cut straight down when you return." And in addition to this type of navigational aid, hunters and navigators in this region use stars, stones, wind, but memory is also incredibly important. So Awa told me that many Inuit people have this ability to commit a staggering amount of visual information to memory. People know places like the back of their hands. And sometimes people don't even need to see these places in person. They just need to hear the descriptions of a place or a route in order to find their way there, which seems incredible to us. Awa told me he had a friend who once traveled 250 miles to a place called Pond Inlet, a place he had never been before, but he just heard someone describe the route to get there and then was able to follow it. So when I was up there, everything looks the same. The rocks, the snow. Awa was telling me, if you watch very closely, this big place, or this place has a big rock. This other place looks the same, but it doesn't have the same big rock. And so you have to watch for these details. And it's that ability to commit detail to memory that really distinguishes them. He credited a lot of this to oral history, the fact that the traditional way of learning in Inuit culture is through words rather than writing. This is a picture of the Western Desert in Australia, and I became really interested in the research of a man by the name of David Lewis. He was a New Zealand sailor, and he had spent many years in the South Pacific learning and researching South Pacific Islander navigation traditions. But at some point, he became really interested in Aboriginal cultural traditions and the way that they found their way in landscapes like this, which, to the outsider also seem pretty featureless. So he went to Australia in 1972, and he discovered that people rarely, if ever, seemed to use external guides to find their way, and yet they were incredible navigators. They could find their way across vast spaces with really stunning accuracy. He said, quote, "All my preconceived ideas of land navigation turned out to be wrong. In place of the stars, wind, and waves that guide Pacific Island canoemen, the main reference proved to be the meandering tracks of the ancestral Dreamtime beings that form a network over the whole Western Desert." So in the book, I write about this idea of the dreaming and the way that, it's very multidimensional and complex, and I don't claim to fully understand it in any, thorough way. But the aspect that really fascinated me was how the dreaming is used as a navigational aid. So there's this enduring stereotype of Aboriginal people going back to colonialism, that they're sort of wandering in the desert in search of food and water. And part of that stereotype, which is, not accurate at all, is that colonizers had a sort of invested interest in this idea that Indigenous people in Australia had no established territories, that they didn't really have ownership over the land. They saw the continent as, a wilderness, as sort of terra incognita that could be laid claim to, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. In the Aboriginal geography, everything on the land, rocks, trees, gorges, and escarpments, were created by their direct ancestors, beings who traveled the world in the Dreamtime. And these movements are recorded in songs, and those songs are inherited by individuals and learned and memorized throughout a person's lifetime. So these songs not only encode ecological knowledge and laws that are followed, but they also have this navigational information, because the beings who created this world through their movements, those movements are recorded in sequences in the songs. So by following their tracks, following those sequences, you can find your way from one place to another. This is a picture I took of a man that I visited in the Northern Territories of Australia. His name is Yiduduma Bill Harney, and he's a waterman leader. He lives on 100 square miles of his ancestral territory called Mengen, near Katherine, Australia. And this is him showing me some really amazing paintings that are on that ancestral land near Mengen. He told me, quote, "I grew up with the song. We sit down and know exactly what name is our places and where we're going. We sing like we know exactly where all these places are. We name them, the routes to travel, right to the end of the songs. I sing one and I follow my dreaming, and my dreaming stops and another dreaming goes on. This woman sitting on the ground is another person that I interviewed in Australia. Her name is Margaret Catherine, and she was a Jawoyn elder. She spent her whole childhood, walking in her traditional country near the Man River. And one of the reasons why my conversations with her has stuck with me for so long is that I was interested in what environmental cues she used to find her way through, her homeland. And I asked her, okay, well, what happens if you get lost? Like, what would you do then? And she really just almost laughed at me. She she felt that this question was like kind of beside the point or not really relevant. And because she considered it almost impossible to get lost. So, the more I learned about traditional Aboriginal navigation, the more that made sense. You could become disoriented in the bush, but you are taught so many sort of different strategies for reorienting yourself. Even in this part of Australia, there are termite mounds that are oriented on a directional axis. So if you did lose your way, if you did not have a story that, or an idea of a route that you learned in a song and couldn't reorient yourself, you could just look at a termite track or mound and actually sort of logically figure out what direction you needed to go in. And I had this similar experience in the Arctic too, with the snow formations. Like, once you see them, it's very hard to unsee them. And so actually it would be very hard to get lost if you've sort of grown up and mastered those environmental cues. But it raised this really interesting question for me about whether getting lost is something that's actually culturally specific. I had always assumed that that must be a universal human experience, that we all lose our way at certain times. And yet here was someone who was telling me, no, like, I've never really experienced that before. And it kind of seemed silly. So I started asking more questions and reading more about this idea. And I turned to the work of someone by the name of Thomas Whitlock, who had spent many years in the Kalahari Desert with the San. And he writes about this thing called topographical gossip among the San, and it's basically a way of describing this incredible amount of discussion that takes place between people about the landscape just on a daily basis. And I thought I would read you something that he said about his experience in the Kalahari. Whitlock explained to me that people tend to generalize navigation from the Western perspective, which is largely about individuals trying to chart and map unknown territory. In his years traveling with the San people of the Kalahari, he rarely, if ever, witnessed them not knowing where they were. Quote, "You drive out on the weekend to Yellowstone Park and then have to find your way in this alien place that you consider wilderness. We Westerners find it very difficult not to transpose or project this perspective of, let's conquer the world, as if this was a human universal," he said. Quote, "Trying to chart an area that you don't know yet is actually a very specific historical situation. It's a skill that is useful for imperialists wanting to create colonies, and GPS is also a very useful tool for going into unknown spaces. The fascination with exploring unknown places is a, quote, different mindset from those in Australia, the San, or the Arctic," he continued. "They do not aspire to colonize the world and occupy places they've never visited. They are mobile, but they are mobile in a restricted sense. They stay within a more or less defined cosmos, and they are not going into uncharted territory. They are doing something quite different." So the more I got interested in these other ways of moving through the world and wayfinding, the more I started to question this idea of the cognitive map, this idea that there was this spatial representation in the brain. And I started reaching out to people who actually sort of dissent from that view of navigation, and really question whether all spatial knowledge really is map-like. And for some people, this idea that aspects of the physical world are copied onto this analogous structure in the mind is really nonsensical. And the reason for this is that maps themselves are cultural inventions. They aren't objective or independent of any point of view. They're not equally valid wherever one stands. And in reality, it's not how most people find their way. As one neuroscientist explained to me, the map itself is a kind of metaphor. But because we are surrounded by maps, we live in a culture that is map saturated, I would say. It's very easy to assume and to use them or to describe a mental process. They are kind of the easiest metaphor to reach for to help us describe and understand our experience navigating. And since the invention of GPS, you can also see many scientists and journalists use GPS as a metaphor for what's happening in the brain. But some people think that's really crazy. That's not like actually a good or accurate way to describe what's happening when we move through space. I found a group of really interesting folks who believe that navigation is really about the pickup of visual information over time as we travel through an environment. It's not knowing where we go, it's knowing as we go. This is one of those people. His name is Tim Ingold, and he had, as a doctoral student, spent time with the Sami in Finland. And he writes that the way the Sami navigated was by memorizing sequences of natural landmarks, and then they would reverse that sequence to find their way back. He defined wayfinding, this term, as a skilled performance in which the traveler whose powers of perception and action have been fine-tuned through previous experience feel his way towards his goal, continuing adjusting his movements in response to an ongoing perceptual monitoring of his surroundings. Sort of a heady way of putting it, but one way that he would describe it, and others to me, is that you can think of it almost as humming a melody. When you go to sing a song, you don't sort of picture the song in your head. You have this memory that just launches you into it. And so he likened it to sort of a musical sequence unfolding over time, is the same way that we travel to a place that we've been to before, and we use our the cues in the environment and our previous experience to get there. I really appreciated Ingold's work because he saw this act of moving through space as this really essential aspect of our being. He thought that perception happens not because we are minds and bodies, but because we are organisms inhabiting our environment, and that paths like musical melody unfold over time rather than across space. Another place that the book focuses on is the South Pacific. I was able to travel to Fiji and Hawaii for this book, but there are many, many other incredible places in the South Pacific with very, very diverse navigation traditions, even from each other. And in recent decades, many South Pacific islanders have undertaken this fight to preserve their traditional navigation practices, in some cases to resurrect them entirely because they've been lost over time. And this is really happening in tandem with this broader cultural renaissance in indigenous language and art and education. There's a lot of places launching these educational organizations, sharing knowledge between islands, starting canoeing clubs. This is the boat on the top here is called the Hokulea. It really helped the building of the boat and the learning how to navigate this boat without any modern technology, just using traditional environmental cues like currents and stars and winds, helped stave off a real cultural extinction in Hawaii. And it led to this creation of something called the Polynesian Voyaging Society. This boat is still traveling the world. I think last week it was in San Francisco, and the week before that it was in Seattle. I saw it in New York. It was a spectacular sight. I was on a place called Governor's Island in the harbor, and the boat came in down the Hudson, I believe, with like the whole of downtown Manhattan and skyscrapers behind it. And you see these like incredible men and women navigating this boat without any kind of maps or modern instruments, surrounded by, sort of the symbol of our modern civilization. It was just like such a brilliant sight and so interesting. But they do travel around. I highly recommend that you sort of track their movements, because you might have a chance to see them someday. So there's now voyaging societies in the Cook Islands, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, Tahiti, Marshall Islands. And in these places, practicing navigation is really an act of self-determination and authority, particularly, after the sort of disruptions of colonialism. It's a very powerful form of self-determination. One of the people I interviewed is a woman named Kala Tanaka Bebe, and I actually interviewed her in Lahaina. And she's a traditional navigator. I thought I would read something that Kala told me about her experience as learning to navigate. In 2014, Kala was a crew member on the Hokulea from Hawaii to Tahiti. Quote, "When I'm away from land and cut off and on the canoe, my mind changes. Immediately in the first 2 days, I'm different. I'm seeing things," she said. "It's 100% relying on yourself to see, hear, and feel. There's no modern instruments, there's no compass. It makes me feel good. I'm not lost." Fear, she said, never enters into the picture. Quote, "I'm more nervous during the last 10 minutes of the voyage when we come back to harbor." For Bebean, navigation is a cultivation of both scientific knowledge, geometry, physics, mathematics, and intangible instincts, a set of intuitions that are nourished and strengthened through experience and eventually, over a lifetime, add up to mastery. Quote, "Stars are actually the easiest part of the puzzle," she said, of what's happening in her mind when she navigates. "We do more dead reckoning. I can't overcomplicate things. Was that 7 knots or 6 knots? You have to be confident. All of the training is to build that confidence in us to make these observations." There are times, she explained, that utilizing navigation skills feels more akin to spirituality than science. Quote, "Some people say traditional navigators were scientists, but spirituality was a part of what they did. And a huge part of what we do is spiritual. Science doesn't account for spirituality." So the book poses a lot of questions too about where we're headed. I use GPS at least half a dozen times to get here today, and to find my way in Newport News, which I've never been to before, and so had no memory of or experience of to rely on. And there's no shame in that at all, but Are sort of the ubiquity of this technology and the ease with which we've adopted it does raise a lot of questions, especially for neuroscientists who study the hippocampus and its centrality to our memory and our sense of self. And so there's a really interesting research being carried out to understand what happens when we rely on GPS to an extent where we're sort of not utilizing this part of our brain as often. And there's really interesting research pointing to all kinds of consequences for us, particularly into older age. Using this part of the brain, exercising it, taking novel routes to places can become a powerful way of sort of maintaining the strength of our memory. And I would encourage, I think the way that I use GPS now is sort of as a living map, but I try not to use the turn-by-turn directions. And so that's how I've sort of found this, I think, compromise in my own personal life between, you know, all of this research that I've done and then the necessity of living in the modern world and navigating places like New Jersey. The turn-by-turn directions completely relieves us of the need to figure out where we are in space and to make inferences and find our way. Whereas if we look at the map and see the route that we take, but then put the phone down and then try to get there, it actually requires us to exercise this part of our brains. It's quite malleable. So there's fascinating research taking place in Montreal, for instance, where they've seen that you know, we can really increase or decrease the gray matter in this part of the brain depending on the type of navigation that we're utilizing and the extent to which we do it. You may have all heard of a really famous study that took place about London taxi cab drivers and the fact that it used to be if you wanted to be a taxi cab driver in London, you had to pass this incredibly difficult test that required you to know all of the roads and you know, be able to create novel routes throughout London in order to become a cab driver. They kind of got rid of that, but they noticed that when they looked at the size of the hippocampus in these taxi drivers, there was noticeable differences between a control group. So yeah, I think that my hope is people not only appreciate the diversity of different strategies and ways of moving through the world, but also just think more about how they find their way through the world and hopefully sort of look up and take note and real pleasure in their surroundings. I'm very happy to answer questions, and I hope that you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you.